I'd like to thank you all for joining us for tonight's webinar. My name is Tinye Verkaitis, and I'm the Executive Director of Physicians for Social Responsibility, Pennsylvania. This evening, we're excited to be joined by award-winning journalist Kristina Marusic to discuss her new book, A New War on Cancer, The Unlikely Heroes Revolutionizing Prevention. In this book, Kristina shows that collectively, we have the power to prevent many cases of cancer. That's because 2/3 of all cancer cases are linked to preventable environmental causes from exposure to toxics. During this conversation, Kristina will weave together stories about the remarkable doctors, scientists, and advocates who are upending our understanding of cancer and how to fight it. As a journalist, Kristina covers environmental health and justice for Environmental Health News. She holds an MFA in nonfiction writing from the University of San Francisco, and her personal essays and reporting on topics ranging from the environment, LGBTQ+ equality, in politics to feminism, food, and travel have been published by outlets including CNN, Slate, Vice, Women's Health, The Washington Post, and MTV News, to name a few. Our moderator, Julie Becker, is a senior public health scholar and climate change advisor who is also on the board of PSRPA. She is also the founder of 3 cancer nonprofits, including the award-winning Women's Health and Environmental Network, which is now merged with PSRPA, where she focused on preventing cancer by limiting environmental exposures. Currently, Dr. Becker's interests include developing curricula for current and future healthcare professionals regarding the nexus between climate and health, and designing programs for older adults about climate preparedness. She holds a master's degree in science policy from the George Washington University, a Ph.D. and master's in public health from Temple University. Before we begin, I'd like to share a quote from Rachel Carson, a Pennsylvanian and the mother of the environmental movement. "The human race is challenged more than ever before to demonstrate our mastery, not over nature, but ourselves." With that, I'll hand it over to Kristina and Julie.
Thank you so much, Tanya. That was a lovely introduction, and I so appreciate that you kicked us off with a quote from Rachel Carson. Thank you all for being here. I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about my new book, A New War on Cancer. If you invented a pill that eradicated 2/3 of all cancer cases, how rich do you think you would be? Do you think you might be Elon Musk rich or Jeff Bezos rich? And a follow-up question, if we knew how to prevent 2/3 of all cancer cases, but nobody stood to get rich from it, would you still think we should do it? I have good news and bad news about that. So the good news first. The good news is that, as Tanya said, up to 2/3 of all cancer cases are caused by exposures that we know we can prevent. And this figure comes from the US President's Cancer Panel, and it's actually conservative. A study by the National Institutes of Health puts this number even higher. They say that 90 to 95% of cancer cases are caused by preventable exposures. But now for the bad news. The bad news is that all of our market incentives are pushing us to continue focusing solely on treatments for cancer rather than prevention. So this chart is from a market research company that serves investors. And as you can see, they project a significant amount of growth in the global oncology market in the next decade. This box of text on the upper left is from the same website. And I've highlighted the part where they're citing the fact that cancer cases are expected to rise by 47% from 2020 to 2040 as evidence of strong growth for the market. And unfortunately, there's no similar market projection for cancer prevention. So in other words, lots of people stand to get Jeff Bezos rich or close to it from investing in treating cancer, but no one stands to make huge profits, not financial ones at least, by investing in cancer prevention. And I certainly don't mean to imply that developing new treatments and cures is not important. It absolutely is. But while we continue to search for a cure, we also need to do more to prevent cancer. So these are some of the reasons I wrote my book, but also, like most Americans and probably most people who are here this evening, I've also had my own personal experiences with cancer. In 2011, my younger sister, Abby, was diagnosed with thyroid cancer, and she was 25 years old at the time, which is very young for a cancer diagnosis. And thyroid cancer usually runs in families, but no one else in my family has ever had it. So we were left wondering if the environment might have played a role in her cancer. I'm also a journalist, and in 2019, still thinking about those questions, I wrote a 5-part series on cancer and environmental exposures in Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania that was titled Prescription for Prevention. These are a couple of the headlines from that series, and the book actually came out of this reporting series. So I won a couple of awards for this series, and I got a lovely note from a publisher congratulating me and asking if I'd be interested in expanding these ideas into a book. And about 4.5 years later, here we are, which is actually relatively quick in terms of writing a book, if anyone here has written one. I should also share that my sister made a full recovery. Didn't mean to leave you hanging on that. She had her thyroid removed and in 2011 and has been in remission for more than a decade. And this is her with her husband and her 2 very cute kids and their goofy golden doodle there on the left. I'll just briefly tell you a little more about my employer, Environmental Health News. We're a news organization that was founded by a scientist named Pete Myers, who's an expert on endocrine disrupting chemicals. And our mission is to increase scientific literacy around environmental health among the general public. You might be familiar with our newsletters focused on environmental health. We have one called Above the Fold that's very popular, but we also do original reporting too. So first I want to share some quick research on where we stand in the war on cancer right now and talk about some new opportunities for prevention. So some of the things I learned while I was reporting on environmental exposures and cancer back in 2019 were really shocking to me. And the first was that since we started tracking cancer incidence in the 1970s, rates of childhood cancer have been steadily increasing. So this chart is for the US, but this trend is generally mirrored at the global level too. And cancer is now the leading cause of death by disease for children in the United States. From 1975 to 2019, incidence of childhood leukemia, which is the most common type of childhood cancer, increased by 35%. And incidence of childhood brain cancer, which is another very common type of childhood cancer, increased by 33%. Nationally, 1 in every 285 American children is now diagnosed with cancer before they reach age 20. We've seen a similar increase, and actually a much more striking increase in some of these cases, in certain adult cancers that are strongly linked to environmental exposures, including multiple myeloma, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and testicular cancer. When I was reporting on that series back in 2019, I interviewed a very smart epidemiologist and pediatrician, Dr. Phil Landrigan, who would later end up writing the foreword to my book. And he said something that was a light bulb moment for me. He said, this increase is too fast to be due to genetic changes, and that our basic diagnostic tools for cancers like childhood leukemia are more or less the same now as they were in the 70s. So this also isn't just us diagnosing more of what's always been there. It's a real rapid increase in childhood cancer rates. And he also said the only other explanation is environmental factors. And that includes, as you know, anything that originates outside of our bodies and our own DNA. So things like smoking and diet, as well as exposure to cancer-causing chemicals and pollution. But Dr. Landrigan also pointed out that those lifestyle factors might play a significant role in adult cancers, but in general, kids aren't engaging in harmful lifestyle behaviors. So this photo, kind of funny because it's not typical and we assume it's a joke, although in 1955, honestly, who knows? But for the most part, kids are not smoking or drinking, and their parents might do those things, but over time, the percentage of parents who smoke and drink during pregnancy has steadily declined, while childhood cancers have continued to climb. One thing that has increased is the number of chemicals that kids and all the rest of us are exposed to on a daily basis. Since the start of the early 20th century, more than 300,000 new chemicals have been invented, and these are novel materials that never existed before on the planet. They're manufactured in enormous quantities and are on track to double by 2030. Some of them are helpful and have radically improved our lives, but most of them have never been tested for safety. And among those that have been tested, most of the ones that we've found to be harmful are still on the market, including many carcinogens. In fact, in the last 50 years, only 5 chemicals have been removed from US markets because they're harmful. The World Health Organization has determined that more than 100 of these manufactured chemicals can cause cancer in humans. And these are some of the places we come into contact with them. So this list is not comprehensive and includes some things that are suspected carcinogens. Everyone on this call is likely familiar with these. It's worth mentioning that lots of other chemicals we regularly come into contact with are known endocrine disruptors. And evidence increasingly suggests that endocrine disrupting chemicals may also play a role in the development of hormone-related cancers like breast cancer and prostate cancer. Our contact with plastics is another major source of these exposures. A 2021 study identified more than 10,000 chemicals used in plastic manufacturing and found that about a quarter of them are substances of potential concern, meaning they're endocrine disruptors. They can cause reproductive harm. They can damage specific organs or accumulate in the bodies of humans and animals. They're toxic to marine life, or they're carcinogens. And more than half of the chemicals the researchers identified as potentially concerning are unregulated in the United States. That bottom stat is from a study by a think tank that I wrote a story about recently that estimated that for all of these reasons, lawsuits against the plastics industry for health and environmental harm are expected to exceed $20 billion by 2030. So we're much better than we used to be at treating cancer, but we're getting a lot more of it. In fact, 1 in every 3 Americans can expect to get a cancer diagnosis in their lifetimes. And just because we're better at treatments doesn't mean we've solved the problem of cancer. More than 1,000 Americans still die of the disease every day. And of course, treatment is difficult. Therapies like chemo can have side effects that last for a lifetime, and survivors have to live with the fear that their disease might come back, feeling anxiety every time they have to go in for a follow-up scan. So we're not winning this war right now. And the main reason we're not successfully preventing cancer is that we're not funding prevention. Globally, just 7 to 9% of all cancer funding goes toward prevention. I'm a pacifist, but if we stick with the war metaphor and we use the more generous estimate of 9%, this would be like spending 91% of our war budget on treating soldiers who came back from the battlefield wounded, and just 9% of our funding on offensive and defensive measures that could prevent them from getting wounded in the first place. And I suspect that no one here tonight is a war expert, but does this sound like the correct budget for a successful war? No, it does not. It's time to launch an offensive war against cancer too, in the form of prevention. And the good news is that some really smart, really capable people are already working very hard on this issue. These are a couple of them who I profiled in my book. And the reason I wanted to profile these folks is that in addition to the funding problems we've discussed, another reason it's easier to advocate for treatments than it is to advocate for prevention is that it's the nature of prevention that we don't get to know whose life we saved. So we don't get a heartfelt thank you from the family we spared the trauma of receiving a childhood cancer diagnosis. And it's easy to feel empathy and want to pitch in when you know who you're fighting for, when you can put a picture of a little girl's face on a t-shirt and enlist help in her battle against cancer. Whereas the story of prevention is often told through numbers and statistics, which are important, but harder to connect with emotionally. So I've structured my book through profiles of these unlikely heroes who are revolutionizing the way we think about cancer prevention, because I wanted to find a way to humanize these statistics and help people feel connected and inspired when they think about prevention. These are some of the people I spoke to in the book, and I wrote not just about their work on this issue, but also about their lives, the family histories, childhood memories, and personal challenges that drive them in their work and motivate them to keep going. The book also includes lots of suggestions for ways that we can all contribute to this fight. So I would encourage you to buy it and read it and tell your friends. And with that, I think I'm a little bit over my time actually, so I will turn it back over to Julie.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful overview. We're going to ask a few questions, and then Kristina's going to do a reading from the book, and then we'll open it up to the folks who are participants, and we'll get some more questions. So my first question to you is, the book follows a group of unlikely heroes that are revolutionizing prevention. How did you choose these heroes?
Thank you, Julie. So I chose people who are very consciously working on systemic change that would protect everyone. I really wanted to make it clear that this isn't a problem we can just shop our way out of as individual consumers, and also that it's not possible and it's not fair to put the onus on individual people to solve this problem, and that this is a challenge that needs to be solved through regulations, market pressure, and other forms of, big systematic change. So when I was reporting on this, I found that talking to those folks and learning those stories made me feel hopeful instead of despair about this issue, and made me want to get involved. So that's more or less how I chose them. I think that all of their stories resonated with me, but one in particular is Melanie Mead, who is a clean air advocate in Clairton, Pennsylvania, which regularly has some of the dirtiest air in the country because of a highly polluting US steel plant that is the largest site in the country manufacturing coke, which is an ingredient used in steelmaking. And it's this really dirty process that involves heating coal to extremely high temperatures. She's been a clean air activist there for years, and has lost every member of her immediate family to cancer, heart disease, or respiratory disease in, I think, an 8-year period. And she's been told, why don't you just move? Why are you still here? She certainly has had periods of wanting to give up, but she's just this really resilient, inspirational person who is determined to stay and fight for cleaner air in her community. And that's my community too. Clairton's only about 20 minutes away from me, where I live in Pittsburgh. And in part because of that polluting plant, we both live in our county that encompasses both Pittsburgh and Clairton is in the highest 1% of US counties for cancer risk from air pollution. So I'm also very personally invested in her fight because it affects my air quality and my cancer risk too. And then also I've just reported on this issue and talked to her as a source and known her for several years. And I think her story is in the last chapter of the book, chapter 6, which is about fence line communities. And I think the other thing that's so inspirational about her story is that I know there are Melanie Meads all over the country and all over the world who are fighting for the health of their communities against really impossible odds, and they're up against powerful forces, but they stay, and they're so devoted to fighting for the right to breathe clean air and drink clean water. And she's seen some successes. I think that's part of why her story is so inspiring too. So due to pressure from her and other activists like her, the plant recently shut down its 3 oldest and dirtiest coke batteries, which is not going to fix the problem entirely, but is expected to clean up airshed a good deal. And so, change is slow, but I find her story really inspirational.
That's great. Definitely sounds like, when I was reading the chapter, it sounds like she's been in this for the long haul, and that really, these kinds of changes take time with which to occur. It's not as immediate as we would like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, you follow a breast cancer patient throughout the chapters named Barry. Why was it important to include her experiences of sort of diagnosis, treatment, and post? And how does her story link to prevention?
So I wanted to make sure to include a story that demonstrates why prevention is so important. I actually initially hadn't included Barry's story when I first set out to write the book, and I really felt that we're missing the voice of someone who has had cancer in this book, and that felt like a really critical voice to include. Barry also grew up in Oil City, Pennsylvania, which is the birthplace of the American oil industry. So including her story also allowed me to explore the role of the oil and gas industry in our carcinogenic exposures. And I when I met her and heard her story, it was so clear. She had a lot of questions similar to my sister. She's the only woman in her family who's had breast cancer. She didn't have the genetic marker that would make her more inclined to have breast cancer. And so she had a lot of questions about the role that the environment might have played in her cancer risk. And she's doing great today. I actually just had breakfast with her on Saturday last weekend to give her a copy of the book. And she is healthy and doing well.
That's great to hear. That's fantastic. You've already mentioned 2 Pennsylvania towns where cancer plays a major role, due potentially from a lot of the environmental issues that are in those towns. So what role does fossil fuel sites and extraction stuff play with exposure to chemicals? And if you could talk a little bit about that, because there are a lot of communities that are facing that, especially when they are near the sites.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So every phase of plastics production, use, and disposal increases our cancer risk, and fossil fuels are a big part of that. 99% of plastics are made from products derived from fossil fuels. So extracting fossil fuels exposes workers and communities to dozens of carcinogens, and that's true whether they're extracted through fracking or conventional wells. And facilities that process fossil fuels into the building blocks of plastic also expose workers and communities to carcinogens. So we have one of those here in Western Pennsylvania, the Shell ethane cracker, that is taking ethane from fracked gas and converting it into tiny plastic nurdles for use in plastic bags and single-use plastic packaging. Transporting these chemicals is also extremely risky, as we just saw with the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment. Those were all product chemicals that are used to make plastic, PVC specifically. And that community has been exposed to a massive load of carcinogens in the air, and drinking water for that community and many communities downstream may be impacted. We're still waiting to see. Only 10% of all the plastics ever produced are recycled, and the rest are either incinerated or put into landfills, or they wind up in the ocean, all of which releases carcinogens into our water and our soil and our air. And the fossil fuel industry is increasingly turning to plastics as renewable energy becomes cheaper and more widely available. So there's a lot of new plastics production facilities that are proposed throughout the US, and certainly in Pennsylvania and the Appalachian region here where I am. And if that happens, we'll have a lot more of all of these things. So we'll have more extraction, we'll have more processing plants, we'll have more transportation of hazardous chemicals through vulnerable communities, and we'll have more plastic to burn or bury or pollute our oceans. And all of those things mean more carcinogens in our air and our water and our soil and our bodies. So I think when we talk about fossil fuels, we traditionally tend to think about transportation, but the industry is seeing the writing on the wall and seeing the shift to renewables coming, and is making this really big turn to try and increase plastics production. And I really think that's the next thing we need to be concerned about and thinking about and talking about when we talk about fossil fuels and cancer risk.
That's both eye-opening and a little scary, but it also provides us with an avenue to kind of think about what are some of the next steps. I think at this point, given our time, why don't you do a bit of reading, and then I've got 1 or 2 more questions for you, and then we can open it up to other folks.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you. I have a copy of the book here. I think it's probably mirrored on your screen. You're also looking at a picture of it still. But I'm going to read just for a couple minutes from the beginning of chapter 2. 5-year-old Zaria bounced up and down as her mother lifted a wooden box full of cosmetics from the top of her dresser and set it on the bed. Her mom's makeup is usually off limits, so Zaria could barely contain herself as she pulled out compacts and tubes of foundation, lipstick, and mascara, asking, "What's this? Where does this go? And how do you put this on?" Zaria has a wide, gap-toothed grin, pierced ears, and a wardrobe full of sparkles. She is nearly fluent in Spanish. She's been in immersion classes since she was 2, and she's passionate about reading and math and makeup. "Hey, slow down, you have to be gentle," said her mother, Ami Zoda, when Zaria aggressively stuck her fingers into an eyeshadow palette, smudging the tidy rounds of powder. As Ami explained what each item of makeup was and where it was applied, Zaria begged her to try them on. "You can pick one thing to try," Ami said. Zaria chose blush. Ami tenderly swept Zaria's hair aside and brushed the powder onto her smooth brown cheeks. "How does that feel? Does it tickle?" "No," Zaria said, closing her eyes. "It feels nice." Within just a few minutes, Zaria had overcome Ami's resistance and convinced her to also apply red lipstick, shiny lip gloss, and shimmery eyeshadow. "It's very subtle," Ami said sarcastically, as Zaria puckered her lips while admiring her new look in the mirror. "What does subtle mean?" asked Zaria. "It means it's not too obvious," Ami explained. "Remember, you don't need any of this stuff, okay? You'll always look beautiful just the way you are." Ami, a public health researcher and professor at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health, is a second generation Indian American with dark curly hair, brown eyes, and a nose ring. She doesn't wear makeup often, but when she does, she favors bold red lipstick. Ami and her family moved to New York in 2022, but were living in Washington, D.C. at the time. I met Ami through work after she launched a program in collaboration with Environmental Health News dedicated to telling stories by historically underrepresented and marginalized voices in science. As she told me why she tries to avoid cosmetics that contain phthalates, parabens, metals, fragrances, and talc, Zaria found a large white banana clip and affixed it above her head, creating a spray of bangs that made her look like she'd walked straight out of an 80s teen movie. "Oh my goodness, you look like you're 13, Ami said. "That's crazy. Go show your dad." Later, while chowing down on a dinner of crispy fish and broccoli at the kitchen table, Zaria repeatedly interrupted the conversation I was having with her parents to ask, "Dad, is the lipstick still on? Can you still see it on my lips?" After one such outburst, she added, "Good thing I have a mirror by my bed so I can keep checking while I'm asleep." Her parents laughed. "Oh no, honey," Ami said. "You can't sleep with makeup on. It's not good for your skin and it would get all over your sheets. You're getting a bath tonight." "Can we put on some more lipstick the day after tomorrow then?" she asked. "No," Ami said firmly to Zaria. Then she explained to me, her school is closed tomorrow for the inauguration. She wants more lipstick the day after tomorrow because she's trying to impress her classmates. It was January 19th, 2021, the day before the inauguration of Joe Biden as the 46th president of the United States and Kamala Harris as the nation's first woman, first Black, and first South Asian vice president. Before trying on her mother's makeup, Zaria had proudly showed me her new copy of Ambitious Girl, a feminist children's book written by Kamala Harris's niece, Mina Harris. I couldn't help but notice that Zaria's life bears some resemblance to the new vice president's. Kamala Harris's mother was an Indian American scientist who researched breast cancer, while Zaria's mom conducts research aimed at preventing cancer and other diseases caused by toxic chemicals in cosmetics and personal care products. Please, can I put on lipstick again just one more time, Zaria wheedled. I just want to be fancy for one day. No, I'm sorry, Ami said. You know when you can be fancy? For the wedding we're going to this summer. Maybe one of your cousins can help you put makeup on for that. Oh, wow, said Zaria's dad, Dave. That'll be such a special treat. Zaria frowned, but nodded, then asked to be excused to go have some screen time. After she left the table, Ami said, this might become a problem. She's really into precedent setting. Now that we've let her do it once, she won't stop asking. A lawyer in training, Dave added, laughing. I have no idea where she's even getting interested in this stuff, Ami said. It's not coming from me. I think it's just so ubiquitous in our culture that she's picking it up, which is a little unsettling. One of Ami's earliest experiences with makeup was her own mother showing her how to use kajal or kohl, dark black eyeliner used throughout the Middle East and North Africa, the Mediterranean, and South Asia. In parts of India, new mothers traditionally applied kohl to their baby's eyes to ward off evil spirits and negative attention. Ami used kohl regularly as a teen, but later learned that it often contains heavy metals and has been recognized as an important source of harmful exposures in some immigrant communities. It's one of many parts of Ami's personal and family history that inspired the work she does today. Ami grew up in rural North Carolina and says that as a kid, she never imagined she would be a scientist or professor. I barely knew these professions existed, Ami said, and I certainly didn't see any female Indian Americans in these roles. Ami's life has been vastly different from the lives of previous generations of women in her family. Her mother, Lata, grew up milking cows and water buffaloes in a rural part of the Northeast Indian state of Gujarat. Lata stopped going to school after 4th grade to stay home and help raise her 7 siblings before entering an arranged marriage with Amin's father, Ramnik, who worked the night shift at the village gas station. Ramnik wanted more opportunities than their hometown offered. He'd always been gifted in school, so he applied for scholarships and received one at a school in the nearest city. When he moved to the United States to complete his medical residency at a hospital in Chicago, Ami's mother stayed behind and lived with his parents until he was able to send for her the following year. When she first moved to the States, Lata didn't speak a word of English. She was still very close with her family, who were now half a world away, and she missed them. Life was very, very hard for her when she first arrived, Ami said. I'll stop there.
That was beautiful, Kristina, just beautiful. So why did you choose this particular reading? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, I think Zaria is kind of one of my favorite characters in the book. She's the only kid who made her way in there, and that's partly just because she's like very precocious and charming and engaging. So I think I just like that scene because I like that Zaria is in the book. She's also she's so excited about being in a book. She's like thrilled that she's included in the book in some capacity. And I think also I wanted to, parts of my talk are kind of focused. The book has a lot of science in it and a lot of statistics and a lot of cited studies. And so I wanted to read a section that is really focused, that's really, humanized, and that's really kind of focused on these stories, because I want to emphasize that that's part of this book too.
And it also emphasizes, at a young age, girls want to try different things, and one of the things they want to try is makeup, and it's maybe not the best for them depending upon the type of makeup you're using. So one of the chapters talks about the role of healthcare, and since PSRPA has a lot of members who are in healthcare, can you talk a little bit about some of the chemical exposures that occur in healthcare and what can be done so that healthcare can truly become a do no harm profession?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. There are a number of sources of chemicals that can increase our cancer risk in medical settings. A lot of times this includes flame retardants in furniture, it's kind of one of the last, you know, hospitals and doctors' offices are some of the few places where like flame retardants in curtains or couches or other like waiting room type of furniture is still sort of common. We know that those are not good for us. Then also there's some risk from some of the sterilization chemicals that are used. And one of the most important sources is DEHP and other phthalates that are used as plasticizers in things like IV bags and IV tubing. There have been a handful of studies that found that patients get a substantial dose of those chemicals through, you know, getting IVs. And then we also see, you know, there's a lot of plastic and some work being done to limit the types of plastic that are used in like a NICU. And there's some concerns about, you know, premature babies being exposed to things like phthalates in plastics too. A lot of that chapter also focuses on ethylene oxide, which is a chemical used to sterilize medical equipment. And it poses some risk to workers, but there's been a lot of new evidence in the last couple of years about risks to the community in places where medical sterilization plants operate. So the types of facilities that's all they do is sterilize medical equipment. And EPA actually just proposed just recently, since the book came out, and I wrote extensively about ethylene oxide in the book, has proposed new regulations for ethylene oxide that would help protect workers and help protect those communities more. So I think there are a lot of pathways to reducing those exposures. Certainly, you know, these steps related to ethylene oxide are really important. I spoke with some, I think there's a role for GPOs to play here. I spoke with someone at a GPO, a group purchasing organization, who was saying that, you know, they're able to encourage hospitals to buy IV bags without DEHP or other potentially harmful plasticizers in them. And then, you know, that can create big shifts in the market because they're making these huge orders for like groups of hospitals or medical systems. Sustainability directors at hospitals can also play a role here. They often have a lot on their plates. They might be dealing with everything from, you know, medical waste to the use of plastic in the cafeteria and energy usage at a hospital. So they have very full plates already, but certainly some sustainability directors are thinking about, you know, how to shift away from flame retardant chemicals in their facilities and how to shift away from chemicals that might raise cancer risk in things like IV bags. And then there's a really great group that I want to mention just in case you're not familiar, which is the Alliance. Hold on, let me actually get the appropriate name. Healthy Environments. Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments. I didn't want to get the name wrong. And they are really focused on all these issues and on environmental health. And I think it's just exciting to see nurses who are kind of on the front lines of this work, you know, coming together to figure out how to tackle these issues and make the facilities where they go to work every day safer for patients.
I have one more question I wanted to ask you, but I do want to just comment. I think the irony of giving cancer patients their drugs via a mechanism that possibly could cause cancer as well, their tubing, is kind of weird in many respects. There's no way to put that other than it's just very ironic. I want you to talk, you talk a lot about this in the book, and you cite that people of color are more likely to be exposed from carcinogen and cancer-causing chemicals. Why?
So there are a lot of things that contribute to disproportionately high exposure to cancer-causing chemicals among people of color, but ultimately they can all be traced to our history of systemic racism in the United States. So First, studies show that people of color are exposed to higher levels of air pollution than their white counterparts. And that's true across state lines, across rural and urban areas, and regardless of socioeconomic status. So I think we all kind of know that, like, we think of environmental justice communities as low income communities of color that are near polluting facilities. But actually, regardless of socioeconomic status, people of color are exposed to higher levels of air pollution. And this is a lingering effect of systemically racist practices like redlining, which pushed people of color into the same neighborhoods and cited undesirable things like polluting facilities and also highways near those neighborhoods. So we're not redlining anymore, obviously, but those effects are still lingering. And similarly, studies have shown that personal care products typically marketed to people of color, like hair relaxers and straighteners, tend to have more cancer-causing ingredients than products marketed to white women. And historically, white colonizers and enslavers used racial differences like skin color and hair texture as justifications for treating Black women specifically as less than human. So striving to eliminate those differences, for example, by having straight hair, became a survival adaptation. And today, some workplace policies still ban traditional hairstyles for women of color, like dreadlocks or afros. This is still an issue today. So last year, federal legislation that would make that kind of workplace discrimination illegal passed in the House, but failed to pass in the Senate. That was called the Crown Act. And it's worth mentioning that even when these hairstyles aren't banned, having straight hair is still often considered a more professional look for women of color. And these are just two examples of some of the many ways that systemic racism has resulted in people of color being exposed to more cancer-causing chemicals than their white counterparts. I cover a lot more of those in the book. And that's actually the focus of Ami Zoda's work. So that section I just read about Zaria and Ami eventually gets into her research on racial disparities in exposure to phthalates and the way she links those to the use of certain personal care products in women of color.
Thank you. So I'm going to take the one quick question from the chat is, are there toxic chemicals also in vaping? In a vapor type?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we're still kind of like, vaping is too new to have long-term cancer studies. So we don't have like 20-year cohorts yet to look at the effects of vaping. So I didn't write very extensively about vaping in the book. All signs point to it's not great for us, but I think it's still early on the science on cancer risk specifically and vaping.
Okay. Are there any other questions from the participants?
I actually have a comment and a question. So I have to agree, it is very ironic that these IV bags have DEHP. It made me think, when I go to the hospital, do I have to ask for a BPA-free bag, so to speak, like how you buy BPA-free bottles? But I'm wondering if it doesn't make sense for people to ask for these things when they're in the hospital. So it's not just a matter of educating the health system, but educating the consumer, because if we all begin to make these requests, then maybe we would begin to see a change because we're asking for that. So thank you for sharing that. My question, though, was about the title of your book. I was wondering if you chose A New War on Cancer because of the analogy that you shared with us in terms of military spending, so to speak, if that was the reason or if it's a different reason.
Yeah, that was the reason. So I think I was really surprised learning those statistics and framing the idea of cancer as a war. You know, the United States has a very tenuous history with like a war on drugs, our war on poverty, our war on crime. And it kind of made me realize like, oh, our war on cancer is just another one of these kind of endless wars that we're waging without actually taking the steps that would be needed to address kind of the heart of the issue. So that absolutely is what I was thinking about when I chose this title, is that a new war on cancer needs to fund and focus on prevention, and specifically preventing our exposure to cancer-causing chemicals in our everyday lives that are unfortunately so ubiquitous.
Well, to piggyback on that, Biden has proposed, quote unquote, a new war on cancer. Has he done anything in terms of his suggested budgets, or have any of the other Health and Human Services or CDC gone more of the prevention route as opposed to diagnosis and treatment?
So I think there are some glimmers of hope in the new cancer moonshot plan. There are more references to prevention in this plan than there ever have been before. Previous moonshots framed prevention as like early testing, early detection, which is of course not actually prevention, it's just early detection. So it's a big improvement that there's any discussion about prevention in a meaningful way at all. Right now, it's still very focused on lifestyle factors. And so the little bit of funding that does go toward prevention is generally focused on smoking cessation, diet, and exercise, which are important and are all things that are worth doing for other reasons too, right? Like those benefit our health in more ways than just lowering our cancer risk. But they're not the only things. And so there are lots of the activists who I talked to for the book, both the ones that made it into the text and just the ones I kind of spoke with on background, are right now in the process of trying to work with the Biden administration to expand the definition of prevention beyond just lifestyle factors and include environmental health in the cancer moonshot. Those talks, because right now the moonshot plan is proposed, so we're in this window before it's final where there's an opportunity to make suggestions. Those talks, my impression is that they have been long and arduous, but you know, people think there are a lot of reasons to be hopeful right now. And I also want to just make it clear that my book is really hopeful and my book is really solutions focused. So I think when you first are hearing some of this, it can feel really alarming and daunting and overwhelming. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to structure the book around people who've made it their life's work to try and tackle this problem. And I also include, you know, a lot of ways in there that we can all pitch in and join the fight, and, you know, find the ways that are feasible for us to contribute, even if we're not, you know, in the street with a bullhorn or leading groundbreaking new research. There are lots of other things we can do to get involved.
One of the questions, Kristina, in the chat is, do you talk about federal regulation of exposures to chemicals in the book?
I do, yeah. I talk about the kind of general regulatory setup we have in the United States. I talk a lot about the kind of limitations and shortcomings of the way we regulate chemicals. And I also compare the way the US regulates chemicals at the federal level with the way that countries that are doing it a little better regulate chemicals at the federal level, specifically in the European Union. And I also talk about the importance of state regulations and the role that market pressure has to play in all of this, because sometimes if a manufacturer of some product, and this is actually true for IV bags, is making a product for a global market, and in the EU, they're restricted from using certain chemicals that could raise our cancer risk, and that company only wants to make one set of whatever the product is, that benefits us too, right? Because then it's easier for them to just follow the rules everywhere than to make two different versions of the same product. And we have a mini version of that with California, because California has much more stringent chemical regulations than any other state. And so California's regulations often end up kind of standing in for federal regulations here, for the same reason, right? That manufacturers aren't going to make one set of stuff to sell in California and then another set to sell everywhere else. So I do talk about all of that fairly extensively throughout the book.
So in our last few minutes, I want to kind of go ahead and, having read your book, it is helpful in the sense that you walk away from this going, there are ways that we can make a difference, both on an individual, on a local, state, and federal level. So I'm going to kind of put you on the spot a tad and say, what would be some of the biggest things that we could think about doing that would help to decrease our exposure and increase our prevention of different types of cancers?
So some of the kind of most accessible things we can do, I think the first one is that, you know, as I mentioned, none of us has to start from scratch. There are a whole bunch of people and organizations that are really devoted to this issue and that are already doing incredible work. And so we can all support them and power up their efforts by donating time or money to specifically the organizations that are driving change. And I included a pretty extensive appendix in the book that lists a lot of those that are doing this at the national level. Another way to help is there are a couple websites where you can sign up to get notifications about pending state and federal regulations by keyword. So, this is hard to say without having it in writing in front of you. I do talk about it in the book, but you can go to these websites and say, I want to get an email alert if basically new chemical regulations are up for a vote. And then you get a notification if those regulations come up. And then that is the time when you start calling lawmakers if you have the time or capacity for that. More generally, you can also let your state and federal representatives know that this issue is really important to you and that you want them to support stronger chemical regulations to help prevent cancer. Another really easy thing to do is that, so I do talk some in the book about things that individuals can do in the meantime while we push for systemic change. I asked everyone I spoke with, what do you do at home? You know, for Ami, what makeup do you avoid? What products do you avoid? What do you try and buy? And if you decide that you're going to start taking some of those individual actions, you can amplify the impact of those choices by letting companies know what you're doing and why. So for example, if you decide to stop buying the hand cream you've used for your whole life because you find out that it has parabens and phthalates and you're worried about the way those chemicals might raise your cancer risk, so you switch to a new one, you can amplify the impact of that choice by letting company A know, hey, look, I use your product all my life and I have stopped buying it because you use these harmful ingredients and I'm trying to reduce my cancer risk. And then you can tell company B, hey, I switched to your product because you don't use these chemicals in your products. Thank you so much for doing that. There's a really great app that can help you make those little switches for personal care products and household cleaning products. They also do it for food items, like grocery store items. It's Environmental Working Group's Healthy Living app. And I find the easiest way to do it is just to wait till I'm running out of something and then use it as a good excuse to upgrade to a less toxic option. So I'll go in there and just type in shampoo and they verify products as not containing any of those harmful chemicals. The last thing I'll mention is that all these groups that are kind of leading these efforts and are really effective have newsletters and are on social media. So another really easy kind of low effort thing to do is to sign up for their newsletters and follow them on social media. So if they're putting out a call to action, like sign this petition or reach out to this lawmaker or vote on this bill, it's easy for you to see those and have them on your radar. And then it's also easy for you to amplify those and share them with your own networks. yeah, I think that's a good start. There's more in the book, but those are a couple quick things.
There's a lot more in the book, and it's so appreciated to have that appendix at the very end. At this point, we're going to start to wrap up, and I wanted to thank so much Kristina Marusic for writing the book, for being so thorough, for using science as a better angel, and in this particular case, also featuring people who we don't often get to hear about and who are really working on issues related to prevention. And I think that hopefully this will start, maybe not a new war, but maybe start a better way to really focus on not having cancer as we go forward. I'm going to close with the following quote from Rachel Carson, and then I'll turn it back to Tanya. We stand now where two roads diverge, but unlike the roads in Robert Frost's familiar poem, they are not equal. The road we have been traveling is deceptively easy, a smooth superhighway on which we progress with great speed, but at its end lies disaster. The other fork of the road, the one less traveled, offers our last, our only chance to reach a destination that assures the preservation of the earth. At this point, I'll turn it back over to Tanya.
Thank you again, Kristina, and thank you, Julie, for moderating this conversation. To all those who joined us, we appreciate it. There will be a recording of this on the website, and we'll share it on social media, so you can also share it out to your friends, and definitely go out and buy the book. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.